A while back, I watched the beginning of The Social Dilemma on Netflix. That's the documentary explaining how tech designers, like for social media, have a pretty terrifying degree of control over billions of people's lives. And, of course, it concerned me and it kind of angered me. And honestly, I didn't really know what to think about it or even believe it. So here we are today with an expert. Let's talk about the effects of social media. Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. With me for this episode is Dr. Robert Wright from Brigham Young University in Idaho. Dr. Wright received his PhD and Master's in Social Psychology and Occupational Health Psychology at Portland State University. His research interests include health behavior change, impacts of technology on health, and the stress and coping process. I've known Rob for at least 5 years through Psychi Journal of Psychological Research. So Rob was one of our favorite doctoral reviewers because he was so speedy and thorough with his reviews. So whenever we had a problem paper, a reviewer dropped out late, we'd always turn to Rob and say, "Help, can you give us a quick and thorough review?" And he always came through for us. So many times, in fact, that a couple years ago, he actually became an associate editor for that journal. And we really owe him a lot for that and appreciate his contributions to the journal. So over the past years, as I've gotten to know Rob, I know he's been doing some really fascinating research on social media. And its correlations such as loneliness, health, well-being. And so when I watched that little bit that I saw of The Social Dilemma, before it kind of upset me and I turned it off, I thought he would be the perfect person to sort of start a conversation with about that here on the show. Welcome, Rob, to Psych Everywhere.
Thank you, Bradley. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
Absolutely. So did you see The Social Dilemma? What do you think about that?
Bradley, I didn't actually see that last year, but I've heard a number of things about it. And the main idea behind that type of a documentary, of course, the big question of, do big companies use tactics to create addictions? And are there ulterior motives behind what big companies do? And, just a couple thoughts. They may be limited since I haven't watched that. And I appreciate your honesty there when you said you only watched the first 15 minutes of it because you had such a strong negative reaction to it. The answer here is really yes, in terms of, is this a possibility? Certainly, we have seen examples of this from other big companies in other big places, such as tobacco, gambling, pornography, and other addictive substances and behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going out there and saying that using social media or social media consumption, rather, is an inherently addictive behavior. However, I don't think it's a far stretch for us to see this also happening with something that's so easy to do, so accessible, so convenient, literally at our fingertips, as we see social media. And especially when we consider incentives for this type of behavior as well: money, control, power, influence. Again, I'm not trying to sensationalize this at all. I'm just merely saying that I do think it is possible. Is it to the extent that The Social Dilemma documentary proclaims that it is? I don't know that I'm ready to go quite that far, but I could see some support for something like this actually happening because we've seen it other places.
For sort of a fun icebreaker question, you're on social media, right?
Yes, I am on social media.
Which platforms do you use? Do you have like a favorite or anything like that?
Well, I have a Facebook account. I have a LinkedIn account. Whether you consider YouTube, social media, I do get onto YouTube periodically. And of course, since the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, Zoom is my right-hand technology to use to communicate with people. And so I do have accounts with those, but I don't have as many as most college students that I've spoken with have.
So how did you get interested in researching social media?
Like most interests, I think, for most scientists and researchers, it was by observation. I was out walking around on campus, and I'd walked around campus many times and seen this, but this one particular time I watched 5 or 6 people pass me by, and they were so engrossed looking at their phone that they didn't even see me. I even said hi to them and they didn't respond. And I got thinking, are we so plugged in all the time that we don't pay attention to what's going on around us? In fact, there was one instance that I was aware of where there was one student who was walking around on campus here, so totally focused on his phone and the screen that he ran straight into a pole with his head. We laugh about that, but that would have had to have hurt. And so those types of things got me thinking, are we doing it so much that it's at the expense of the moment? And we know with things like mindfulness, meditation, flow, those types of things, being in the moment is so important to our own health and our well-being that I wondered if social media might be drawing us out from it. Perhaps at times a needed distraction, but are we relying on it too much? That was my original idea about why I got into investigating social media and its implications for health.
Well, let's talk about some of the specifics. Could you share what are some specific effects or correlations of social media that you've come across in your own research?
Absolutely. So we conducted, again, based on that idea that I mentioned there, watching people around campus being so engrossed, we thought that maybe they might be a bit lonely. In fact, we've seen this as an epidemic of sorts, alongside with the obesity epidemic, and then, of course, currently the pandemic of COVID-19, of perceived loneliness going quite high among college students in particular. So in a recent study I conducted with my colleagues, we explored perceptions of loneliness and daily time spent on social media among nearly 600 college students who were all self-identified as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at a private religious university here in the Intermountain West known as BYU, Idaho. And what we were really trying to do here is look at a homogeneous group, in particular, a religious group, which by definition should be somewhat protected by the effects of loneliness that can be experienced as a college student. Now, this was a self-report, one-time survey that we sent out to these nearly 600 students. So we cannot claim clearly any causal direction. But the associations we found were very clear. First, those who spent more time on social media, and we measured this as daily time spent on social media. So those who spent more time reported feeling lonelier. Now, that could be that people who were using social media more were then more lonely, or it could have been that those who were lonely were turning to social media more. But that was the first finding. The second was that loneliness and time spent on social media separately were related to important health variables, including depressive symptomology, diet, typically poor dietary behaviors, so eating fewer fruits and vegetables, eating more of your sugary snacks, sugary beverages, poor sleep, and their overall subjective health was lower as well. So the more time on social media and more loneliness that was related that way. Third, those who use social media the lowest, so we split them into 3 different groups, and we had the low group and the average group and the high group of using social media. Those who use social media the lowest amount reported much lower perceived loneliness, whereas the difference between the average and the high group was really rather small and negligible. So the implication there was that the less that we use social media, the lower the perceived loneliness. But if we used it on average, that wasn't quite enough. It needed to be lower. And then our fourth finding with the study was that two groups seemed most at risk for experiencing greater loneliness and spending more time on social media. And those two groups were women and those who reported to not be in a involved romantic or committed relationship. So those two groups there seem to be, again, more at risk of spending more time on social media and also reporting greater perceived loneliness. So springboarding off that first study, we had another study to follow up, which was based on the idea that not all social media would impact us the same, that certain social media platforms would have to impact us in a different or more profound way than others. And so as a follow-up to that original study where we found the relationship with loneliness and social media, we conducted two other studies that examined the well-being of users of different social media platforms across 5 specific platforms in a college student sample, those 5 platforms being Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, Marco Polo, and LinkedIn. And this is among a college student sample, again, of about 600. And we picked these 5 initially because of their diversity, their popularity. Of course, Facebook, immensely popular, Instagram as well. Marco Polo, not quite as popular. In fact, many people may not have heard of it before. It's more popular here on the West Coast and Intermountain West. And then also the differences between Facebook and Snapchat in terms of being more for personal, private use, and LinkedIn being much more professional type use. So we were trying to get 5 that we could really compare. Now, participants completed, again, an online questionnaire assessing their daily use of these social media platforms, and then some health-related constructs in the social, mental, and physical domains. And again, this study was a one-time self-report online survey, so no clear causal directionality can be established. However, the results suggested some very interesting things. First, those who used image-based social media. So what I mean by image-based is primarily the platform, at least in its original form, was based on sharing images. And the example perhaps that most people would be familiar with would be Snapchat. That users of these image-based social media platforms showed the most health deficits compared to those who did not use these image-based platforms. Specifically, this was Snapchat. The users of Snapchat compared to those who did not use Snapchat had higher depressive symptoms, higher negative mood, greater loneliness, and lower overall satisfaction with life. Second finding we had was that users of video-based platforms such as Marco Polo, which is where you create a little video of yourself and you can share it with other people. So you record a video and then it's a platform where you can share it with specific people. And professional, and we classified LinkedIn as a professional social media platform, that these people who used these platforms compared to those who did not use these platforms had the best well-being profiles, including greater positive mood and perceived peer support, as well as lower loneliness compared to those, again, who did not use Marco Polo or LinkedIn. So the third major implication of this then is it seems that some social media may be potentially more harmful than others in terms of our psychological and overall well-being, at least among college students. However, and this is a big however, Bradley, however, regardless of the platform used, we found that increased total daily social media time spent was related to worse outcomes among the college student sample. So regardless of what platform was being used, the more you used it, the worse the outcomes were in general. Now, of course, then this begs the question of, okay, well, that's great. That's about college students. And college is a unique time of life. You can explore different things. You have a lot of flexibility, maybe not too much money, as those of you who are listening and going to college probably can resonate with. But it's an exciting time of life. Your attitudes haven't crystallized. They're still forming, and you're still making associations with people that can last for a lifetime, opinions, attitudes. And so there's some characteristics about college students that may not generalize to everybody. So we did a third study, and we basically repeated the second study here, looking at the different social media platforms and their potential impacts or potential associations with health and well-being among a large sample. We had 2,083 participants who recruited over Amazon's MTurk, which is a crowdsourcing platform where you can get on, you could do little jobs and you get paid for it. So they'd complete a survey and then we would pay them for it. And we included an additional 3 platforms. This included WhatsApp, Skype. Please note this study was done before the pandemic hit and before Zoom became as popular as it has been. And then we also added Twitter. And the results were remarkably consistent with our college student sample study. Again, users of image-based platforms such as Snapchat, again, showed the most significant well-being deficits, greater negative mood, greater loneliness, more conflict interpersonally, more perceived stress and anxiety as well. And this was compared to those who did not use these image-based platforms like Snapchat. But then on the other hand, users of video-based, and we used Marco Polo and WhatsApp as examples of video-based, and then of course LinkedIn as the professional, manifested the best well-being profiles, including improved mood, better overall health, and health behaviors, diet, sleep, exercise, and higher life satisfaction compared to those who did not use those platforms. And then again, the same finding, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but this was with a separate sample, a larger sample, more diverse sample here, that again, regardless of the social media platform one used, the daily social media time spent predicted poorer health outcomes. So the implication was clear. Some of them seemed to not have as much of an impact, but overall, the more time we spend, it seems that it's just consistently related to poorer health outcomes.
Well, that was a great answer. I really appreciate you taking the time to take us through your process and through the order of all 3 of those studies and the implications of those. I'm going to put a link to each one in the show notes, listeners, in case anyone would like to go check those 3 out. So outside of your research, what might be some other effects or correlations that have been established with social media?
So that's a fantastic question that's on everybody's mind here, right? What's going on with social media? As I thought about this, and when you ask me here now, the rapid access to information can lead to an overconsumption of social media, which makes sense. But this would include the passage of time. We've all sat down, and before we know it, 15, 20 minutes, maybe even a full hour has passed by. And what have we done? Absolutely nothing. We've got up to date about Aunt Gertrude and her new baby or something like that, but we really haven't done anything. And so that wasting of time. And maybe that's the best outcome. There's certainly other more negative things. Misinformation. I just think about all the propaganda is a strong word, Bradley. And so I don't know if I want to use that. If you agree with me, maybe you can keep that in there. But there's a lot of information out there. Anybody can post anything. It's like the Wikipedia dilemma that we had several years ago, that anybody could post anything about a certain topic. Well, that's happening now, but on a much more grand scale. Opinions are being shared as facts, and it's really difficult to sift through this information unless you're a very well educated person, which it's hard to be these days. It's hard to know what to believe and what not to. I think that's an effect of social media that's just sneaky, because we may read it and know that it's not false, or maybe be skeptical about it, But then someone asks us 2 or 3 days later, and that misinformation effect comes right in. And we say, well, I don't remember where I heard this, but this is what I heard. And it was on that social media site, and it really wasn't factual. It was just someone's opinion. I'm afraid there's a lot of information about the pandemic that has been distributed this way that has really impacted our society, our global community's ability to fight back with this pandemic. I think that's an effect of it. And then, of course, as my research kind of pointed out, sedentary lifestyles. Generally, we sit down to consume and to watch social media, and that doesn't help our physical health either. The more time we sit down. In fact, a few studies recently have identified that sedentary behavior, just sitting for extended periods of time, can be as detrimental to our health as regular exposure to secondhand smoke. In fact, it may be even more. Some studies are suggesting it's even more. We know the number one thing we can do to improve our health is to either not smoke tobacco or to stop if we are. And so we're putting sedentary behavior up in that realm. So there's some effects there, I think, of social media that are sneaky that we might not even be aware of. And so it makes it all the more pernicious and detrimental to us. Now, whereas the convenience of the medium is certainly alluring and draws people in, I like how one of my student collaborators put it. Social media is the empty calorie of communication. In essence, it is a convenient but less fulfilling, less human way of communicating. As such, I fear that our interpersonal communication skills have and will continue to diminish and deteriorate the more that we rely on social media. And so, Bradley, that's just a couple of my thoughts, beyond my research findings, and speculating and drawing on some other people's research in the area that really should give us pause about how much time we're spending on social media.
So I know that you found increased daily use of social media was related to increased detrimental outcomes. But how do you know if you're addicted to social media and it's like bad for you? Is there like a set amount of time per day that you would consider to be too much time or anything like that?
The too much, and I'm thinking about putting it in quotes because it's so relative. Yet we do see that there, or at least in theory, there must be a ceiling, right? And if you hit that ceiling or that threshold rather, and go above that, then it's bad. I do think it fluctuates between people. I do think it fluctuates within people, on particular days. However, I would think that a good test to figure out whether you really need to cut back or whether you are doing too much, as you said, would be that if you're showing some of these symptoms or signs that our research has identified, which would include, but are not limited to, of course, increased feelings of loneliness. If you're feeling more irritable, if it's more difficult for you to get along with people, depressive symptoms, if it's difficult for you to be motivated to get up and do something, interpersonal conflict, if you're having more conflict with other people, again, that goes along with irritability and negative mood states, stress or anxiety. Now, those two are a little bit challenging because of our typical busy lifestyles. We generally tend to load a lot of things into our schedules and put a lot of expectations, even on ourselves. And so that can stress us out there too. But I think these are some signs, at least potentially, that you might want to consider that you might be spending too much time on social media. Now, this is not a clear-cut way to diagnose, if you will, a problem. But it may be these may be some initial warning signs of a potential dependence or at least an overconsumption of social media. So if you find yourself fitting this kind of a profile, I would suggest identifying a healthy replacement behavior. This could include going outside in nature. Now, I'm in Rexburg, Idaho, and we really don't have hospitable temperatures till about July. But going outside, getting some fresh air, wonderful idea to get up and move a little bit. In fact, I mentioned exercise, but if that word scares you, let's call it physical activity. Just get up and move, do something. Something that you enjoy, reading a book, cooking, maybe picking up a new hobby. That was what I picked up largely over the pandemic. Was I tried cooking, and I found out that that's a wonderful thing to do. Now, of course, Bradley, I do have to confess, I have found a number of the recipes that I've tried with my newfound hobby of cooking on social media. So, there's a give and take here, but if you can engage in a favorite hobby or explore a new hobby you've always wanted to try, or another one, which is kind of counterintuitive, but serving. If you can go out into the community or go into a church group, or even with the confines of your own family, and just do something for them. I think there's a lot that can help there in terms of these potential effects of overconsumption of social media. Another obvious thing, which, Bradley, you had mentioned to me before the podcast, but you can delete a few of your different accounts. If you find that you're spending too much time on one, or if you're finding consistently getting onto one platform, and I'm not going to name any specifically here. I don't want to slander any or be seen as such. But if there's one that you feel that you're not getting that fulfillment from, or you're wasting a lot of time, you can always delete that. Now, regarding the question, what is too much? Again, that answer is difficult, but I understand our listeners probably want to know a number. And so our study suggests that if you're spending an average of more than an hour and a half per day on social media, that you are in the upper echelon compared to other college students. So again, an hour and a half per day. Moreover, in another study we conducted that's currently under review for publication, so I don't have that available to share, but I can tell you a few of the findings. We examined the differences in technology use, specifically looking at TV watching, TV binge watching, which is where you sit down and watch for an extended period of time, social media use, of course, and then computer, looking at a screen use. And for those who are in college before the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions were in place, that was March of 2020, and then compared that to those college students during the COVID-19 pandemic or after March of 2020. Sample size was nearly 1,000 college students, and the results demonstrated a dramatic increase in electronic media consumption. This included a 30% increase of daily screen time. Now, that could be explained by typically face-to-face courses having to resort to Zoom or Skype or other social media, using a screen. But that 30% increase equated to 2.5 hours additional screen time per day. Now, we cannot clearly say that the COVID-19 pandemic caused this. However, it's a strong implication because before the pandemic, it was 2.5 hours less than it was during the pandemic. Now, certainly that's not all because of social media. So coming back to that, daily social media time reportedly increased by an average of 25 minutes per day, again, on average. However, it is likely that this is an underestimate, as I'd ask you, Bradley, as well as our listeners. Do you really know how much time you spend on social media?
Oh, no. I don't want to know.
And maybe some of us, like you said, don't really want to know. It's incredibly difficult to know just how much time we actually spend on social media. So even with these limitations in mind, it seems from this study that's currently under review that we are on a course to increase our use of social media on average, at least as college students, rather than the decrease that our initial studies suggested we really probably should be doing. So that was a long-winded answer there to your question, Bradley, but those are some numbers for our listeners who may want numbers.
That's great. So I have one more question that was prepared. I would think that not all social media use is bad. So do you think that there's a good way to use it? And do you have any tips for that?
Absolutely. In moderation. Not a very satisfying answer, but a true answer. At least all the research that I've read and looked at and that I've conducted myself, that's the conclusion. In moderation. So not too much. And we already discussed a little bit about what too much is, but the answer again seems complicated. It may be specific to different people, contexts, or even jobs. Some jobs or vocations are going to require the use of social media. I even mentioned earlier that my newfound hobby of cooking required social media a little bit. So I'm not trying to say that social media is uniformly or ubiquitously poor or bad. In fact, there's many good things that can come from it too. I think the best way for us to achieve a good use of social media, again, is to closely monitor its effects on our mood. Our mood is typically more responsive, or at least it's responsive in a quicker way. So we might be able to notice a change in mood and be able to recognize that it might be due to using social media more, initially before depression or before loneliness kind of kicks in. But using social media to connect with others is certainly a positive and valuable benefit. Being more mindful of the time you spend, the content that you observe, and the material that you peruse would be a good first step to not allowing yourself to be drawn in where you can lose a sense of control, a sense of time. One final thought that I had may also be the motivation for your use of social media. Are you going on to social media to gather information, to post information about yourself? Are you bored? Are you turning to it simply for entertainment? And, as you answer those types of questions, personally, I think that might also be a way for us individually to recognize whether there needs to be a change. And I'm not saying that any one of those motives is necessarily bad. Again, I think that there's value in all of them. Certainly, after a long day, you just want to check out. But we do need to recognize that for certain motivations, we may be more vulnerable or more susceptible to these underlying potentially damaging or potentially negative impacts of prolonged use of social media.
Well, that's my last question. Did you have anything that I've missed or that you'd like to add?
Maybe one comment I might share here in closing, and that is, I really do hope that this research, my research, and what we're doing into figuring out the impacts of social media, I really do hope that it helps people. Oftentimes we think about cool findings or, well, that's really neat, just because the information is neat or just because the information is new or novel. But I really like the applied nature of my research and of social media here, because you can take the suggestions and the findings of this and you can incorporate it into your life even today and make your lives better today. And so I hope that our listeners, that they find some use in being able to personally apply these findings to their benefit.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you so much for talking with me today, easing my fears a little bit.
Well, great. Thank you, Bradley.
You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. Listeners, how are you enjoying the show? We have a new SurveyMonkey survey that you can take any time to share about your Psych Everywhere experience. It just takes a few minutes and it will help us determine future content and other ideas for the show. Visit www.psychi.org/podcast, and I'll put a link directly to SurveyMonkey in the show notes as well. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, you know the drill. go ahead and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth, as you know, is a huge help for a podcast. So share what you learned with a neighbor the next time you chat over your picket fence or in your classes. You can also follow us on Twitter at SciChi Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcast or wherever you go for podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day. And more importantly, you'll be helping to get psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll connect with you again soon. Copyright 2022, SciChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.